KQED Public Radio, this is Forum. I'm Scott Schaefer, here today for Michael Krasny. In this hour of Forum, a conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Samantha Power. Her new book, Chasing the Flame, is a biography of UN diplomat Sergio Vieira de Mello. Before he died in a terrorist attack in Baghdad 4 years ago, he was a troubleshooter in some of the world's most troubled countries, including Bangladesh, Bosnia, Kosovo, and East Timor. We'll hear what he learned in those conflicts and what he was trying to do in Iraq before he was killed. All that plus your phone calls in the next hour of Forum, right after this. And welcome back to Forum. I'm Scott Schaefer, and today for Michael Krasny. The name Sergio Vieira de Mello may not be familiar to you, but he's among the most distinguished and respected diplomats and humanitarians in United Nations history. In August of 2003, Vieira de Mello was heading the UN's political team in Iraq when he and 21 others were killed by a suicide bomber's attack in Baghdad. Iraq was an assignment he didn't really want, but Vieira de Mello was used to political hotspots. In 3 decades with the UN, he spent time in East Timor, Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Sudan, and Lebanon, among others. At the time of his death at age 55, Vieira de Mello was considered by some as a future Secretary General for the UN. His life is the subject of a new book called Chasing the Flame, Sergio Vieira de Mello and the Fight to Save the World. And author Samantha Power is our guest this hour. Welcome to Forum.
Great to be here.
For those of our listeners who do not know him, tell us about him. What kind of a person was he?
Well, he was previewed for me. I was a rookie reporter in Bosnia in the early 90s, and he was the number 2 UN official in that mission. And somebody told me that as I was about to go and meet him, that I was going to meet somebody who was a cross between James Bond on the one hand and Bobby Kennedy on the other. And there's something in that. I mean, he was Bond in that he was a great ladies' man, incredibly charismatic, very ingenious, narrowly escaped dying a number of times in his career because he was always where the bullets flew. And he was Bobby Kennedy because it was sometimes hard to tell whether he was a realist masquerading as an idealist or an idealist masquerading as a realist, to go back to Arthur Schlesinger's formulation vis-a-vis John and Bobby Kennedy. What drew me to him at this point in our country's history was the recognition that we, as we look forward onto the horizon of the 21st century, are staring down at all kinds of new threats and challenges that we don't have the tools to deal with. I would call them broken places, broken people, undergoverned spaces, failing states, these kinds of places. And those are precisely the places that Sergio spent 34 years of his UN career working in. And my feeling is we're all coming so late to these questions that if we could look to this life, which was both lived in the field, in all the war zones you mentioned, but also lived with an unusual degree of self-reflection, self-criticism. That was, I think, one of the things that distinguished Sergio. He was by no means a perfect human being or a perfect diplomat, but he was remarkably self-correcting and adaptive. And so if there was some way in which, by walking in the footsteps with Sergio, we could short-circuit some of the learning that we need to do in a hurry, both as the United States and as part of the international system, it seems to me that that would be a very worthy exercise and a very urgently necessary one.
One of his philosophies, I guess you could say, as his career developed, was that you engage the enemy, that you talk to your enemies. And that's something that this country grapples with all the time. How did he come to that point of view, and was it an evolution, or did he always feel that way?
It was definitely an evolution. He started off, he's Brazilian, son of a Brazilian diplomat, and the Brazilian military took over in 1964, actually forced his father into retirement when he was a young man, looking up at his dad. And he said at that point, I will never go into government, I will never work for Brazil, I hate Brazil, I don't trust politics. And he joined the UN, having done his undergraduate work at the Sorbonne, studied philosophy, and having stormed the barricades and thrown stones at the Parisian police and been something of a Marxist. But he joined the UN believing that the UN was somehow an antidote to state power. In other words, if you look at the UN as we understand it today, even as 2 things. On the one hand, the place we park our principles, principles of fundamental freedom, of self-determination, and so forth. But on the other hand, as a gathering of today 192 countries, principally a building where countries come, sadly, not to be more noble than they were before they entered the building, usually just to advance their own national interests. Sergio, when he was drawn to the UN, he was drawn to the principled part of it. He didn't kind of read the small print about it being a gathering of state power. So he thought he was turning his back on states when, in fact, he was walking into a den of states. So initially, he would take those principles and he would wave them in front of states who were deviating from international norms. He would denounce individuals and harm-doers, wrongdoers, rebels, heads of state, you name it. He was a sort of shrill advocate on behalf of humanitarian and human rights norms. At a certain point, he came to realize that he was getting nowhere, that ultimately, unless he had some of the member states of the UN at his back actually being willing to enforce or to use their leverage to press other countries to respect international norms, he was just a kind of pathetic civil servant waving a UN charter, waving his Carolina blue UN passport. And so from about his mid-30s, and I would date it actually to his mission in Lebanon after the Israeli invasion, Palestinians were using the UN base as a place from which to launch raids. The Israelis respond by basically trampling the UN en route to Beirut in 82. At that point, he said to himself, you know what, I'm never going to use the word unacceptable again. I'm going to get in the room with people who are violating international norms, whether the Palestinians in that instance or the Israelis for crossing the international border. And while in the room, I'm going to actually black box what they've done before we get into the room. So I'm going to, you might even say, check my principles at the door.
So was he leaving behind his idealism?
I think he was accommodating his idealism to a very ugly and messy world, but there's no question that he went too far. That is, he went from shrill denunciation outside the room to being in the room, and I think, for instance, when I met him in Yugoslavia, he was known not as Sergio, but as Serbio, for his capacity to be obsequious with Slobodan Milosevic or with other harm-doers. By the end of his career, and I don't want to spoil the trajectory of it, because it's totally fascinating to watch a man consistently trying to advance his ideals, but believing at one stage that denunciation is the right way, another stage that obsequiousness is the right way. And then finally at the end, I think, ends up where, and we're debating this in our own domestic presidential election today, but where I think the person, Barack Obama, who I happen to be advising a little bit on foreign policy, ends up, which is you get in the room because you have to know your foe. You get in the room because you can get international wind at your back by being in the room. But when in the room, you don't forget what's been done before you got there.
And what your principles are.
And what your principles are. And that it actually can be tougher to be in the room and to be engaging than to be denouncing from a million miles away.
How controversial was it within the UN as he came to this realization that you have to talk to the bad guys, the really bad guys, I mean, the evildoers in the world, the real evildoers. How controversial was that within the UN, or were others there ahead of him on that?
Well, one of the amazing things when you open up a life like his, lived in these broken places, is the degree to which what to us and to the naked ear may sound like synonyms, such as human rights, humanitarianism, peace, justice, all these sort of noble ideals and these noble goods, when actually lived in practice, they are at cross purposes with each other more often than not. So in fact, within the UN system or within the NGO community, within any community of so-called do-gooders or wistful do-gooders, there's actually something of a clash between, for instance, people who believe in a pure humanitarian imperative. For instance, Sergio was in Congo in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, and he believed in the humanitarian imperative. He believed that the people who spilled out of Rwanda in the wake of the genocide, which included the genocidaire, the people responsible for the murder of 800,000 people, but also included maybe 1.5 million, 2 million Hutu civilians, that those people needed to be fed above all. In the human rights community, people felt, hey, you got to cut off the spigot of international life support. These are genocidaire after all. And what Sergio did is, of course, he went back to the member states and he said, I need help separating the sheep from the wolves. There are wolves in these camps. Would you, member states, United States, Belgium, and others, who turned your back on the genocide, be willing to give me some police or some enforcement power now so I can pluck from these camps the people who are these terrible evildoers? And unsurprisingly, the same governments who didn't want to do anything during the genocide certainly didn't want to do anything about the genocidaire after the fact. But I mention this because he's in the room with the genocidaire. He doesn't want to turn off the spigot of life support, but he's making decisions that it's all lesser evils terrain. You're either potentially abetting the genocidaires who are planning to go back to Rwanda and continue what they started in the genocide, or conceivably you turn off the life support and that results in massive outbreaks of disease or starvation. And so depending on whether you were a human rights person who believed that you should just hold governments or non-state actors accountable to a set of principles, or you were a grocery deliverer, as he used to say, or a macaroni deliverer, an aid giver, that depended on how you, whether you judged Sergio's approach positively or negatively in the moment. I mean, he was beloved as an arch pragmatist in a system where ideals were maybe too often advanced by pure idealists who didn't know how to deal with states. So there was a sense that if you had an agenda, if you could get Sergio to do your bidding for you, charming both the dictators and the rebels on the one hand, but also international Western diplomats on the other, then you'd have a better chance of getting what you wanted.
Did he worry about being used?